For decades, Hollywood has shaped popular perceptions of Native Americans through the lens of certain stereotypes. From the noble savage to the mystical shaman, these limited and often inaccurate representations have perpetuated misconceptions and overlooked the rich diversity and complexity of indigenous cultures. In the realm of Westerns, Native Americans have often been reduced to one-dimensional antagonists, depicted as savages attacking settlers or mere obstacles to be overcome. These portrayals have reinforced harmful stereotypes, furthering a distorted narrative of indigenous peoples. These stereotypes have been further perpetuated in modern conspiracy theories which seek to remove the agency of indigenous people by underplaying their achievements, or in some cases even removing them from the historical narrative altogether. Unfortunately, Hollywood stereotypes and conspiratorial claims have come to dominate the popular imagination and have fundamentally shaped and altered how most American people view Native American. In this video, I will be exploring the Mississippian culture, one of my favorite civilizations to study. In doing so, this video serves two purposes. First of all, to educate about Mississippian culture by exploring their fascinating history. The second purpose, which may be a bit more subtle but equally as important, will be to shatter these stereotypes and misconceptions about natives. Mississippian culture stands out because it is so different from how natives are often portrayed. These were people who oftentimes lived in large cities, governed by complicated political systems, supported by large-scale agricultural infrastructure, and who produced superstructures in the form of earthen-worked mounds. I hope that you enjoy this video, and if you do, please like and leave a comment in the comment section below. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm beginning a discussion of native civilization or even just ancient civilization in general is to start off my class with a little bit of a thought experiment to kind of get everybody thinking about how exactly historians and archaeologists explore ancient history and the methods by which they uncover the past. North America specifically will present some unique obstacles, which is why I like to facilitate this conversation and to kind of get us thinking about these things in general. So here's the thought experiment that I like to begin with. Suppose there's a couple different ways to form this scenario. We can get as silly as we want, right? Maybe it's 300 years in the future. You've been sent out on a rocket ship to explore some other planet, and you discover the ruins of some ancient civilization. How exactly would you go about finding out more about that civilization? How would you come to understand their culture, their politics, their religion, their art? How would you learn more about them? So I'll wait to get some student responses, and typically speaking, I get the same sort of general answers. Right? There's some various obvious things that we can examine to learn more about them. First and foremost would be the physical stuff that they left behind, the buildings, the structures, the tools, the equipment, whatever it is that we still have physically lying around might be some insight into who they were, what they did, and how they did it. Another very common popular response I get that's a little bit morbid, but that is spot on, would be to see if we can find any physical remains, see if we can find any skeletal remains of the people that once inhabited this area. And by examining those skeletal remains, we can get a sense of all sorts of things: lifestyle, diet, living conditions, you name it. But without a doubt, the most popular response I get would be to look for some sort of writing, to look for some books that they left behind, some stones that they engraved, some whatever, or forms of media if we're talking about some alien civilization, right? And for the most part, this is our general approach when dealing with and learning about ancient civilizations. For some civilizations, this is easier than others. What do I mean by that? Well, look at an ancient civilization like Egypt. We have a tremendous amount of, going back to those items that I listed off earlier, physical stuff that was left behind, structures, such as the pyramids of Giza, pictured here, and the Sphinx. With Egypt, we've also discovered many different houses, living conditions, tools, pottery. We have a ton of pottery from the ancient Near East. More importantly, I mean, I say importantly for me as a historian, because what we're primarily doing in history is examining the written record, right? So, more importantly, we have a tremendous amount of writing from ancient Egypt that covers all sorts of things. One of the areas that I'm most interested in is the history of religion. And we actually know a good deal about ancient Egyptian religious beliefs because they wrote it down. We have, for example, the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, so we can get a general understanding of their cosmology, their view on gods and goddesses and the afterlife. But the fundamental issue here, going back to North American civilization, is that unfortunately we don't have a lot of those things for Native American civilizations. And there are some very practical reasons for this. Going back to the buildings and the structure example that I gave, think for a moment what were the primary construction material that the ancient Egyptians used? Also think about where Egypt is located geographically speaking. So one of the big materials that they used was either brick or stone. Stone has a extremely long lifespan as a building material, in the sense that if you carve a stone and leave it in a field, it's going to stay there for a very long time. And in the case of ancient Egypt, if you build a structure out of stone, it's also going to stay there for a really long time. Another extremely important factor here would be the geographical location. Egypt, although we have the Nile River that the ancient Egyptian civilization was built on and around, is a very hot, arid and dry environment. And so not only do we have the stone structures that the ancient Egyptians built, but we also have their writing in the form of papyrus that we have found. So not only are their buildings preserved, but their writing and the paper that they wrote it on are also preserved because of that hot, arid environment. The same is true of a lot of Middle Eastern civilizations. If you look at like ancient Sumeria, ancient Israel, Babylon, Assyria, take your pick. One of the big reasons why we know a lot about them through their writing is because they either carved on stone or clay tablets, or they wrote on parchment or papyrus paper like the ancient Egyptians, and because of the environment in which they stored this paper, it kept for a very long time. I say that this is an issue because we simply don't really have that with North American ancient civilizations. First and foremost, we can look at their building material. North American civilizations primarily used organic building material, much in the same way that we do today. Their primary construction material was wood, grass, clay, dirt, or a mixture of all three of those things kind of put together. And I say that's a problem because, going back to my stone example, you carve a stone and leave it out in the field. How long is it going to stay in that field? Hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. Carve a piece of wood, leave it out in the field. How long is that piece of wood going to last? How long is it going to be discoverable? A fraction of the time. So although these North American civilizations built things such as houses, cities, walls, because of the material they built it out of, we don't have a lot of it left, with the exception of the earthen mounds they build. But we still have the earth left, although it's been eroded over thousands of years by water, rainfall, and rivers in some cases. Another piece of that puzzle is also environment. In ancient Egypt, like I mentioned before, we're talking about a hot, arid environment that is ideal for preserving things like parchment paper and writing, for example. We don't have that with North American civilizations. The environment is much different. It's still hot. I live in the American Southeast. It's still hot, but another part of that heat is the humidity. It is extraordinarily humid. It's a wet hot as opposed to a dry hot. Not that I've felt the difference much, right? It's still just hot, but it's a very humid, moist environment, which, because of going back to that organic material that they used to build, isn't going to do a lot of favors for building materials like wood. If you own a house in the Southeast that is primarily composed of wood, you know all about the rot and the mold and the decomposition that takes place on a regular basis. So ultimately, unfortunately, it's because of this geography, environment, the building materials that they used, that we don't have as much stuff left behind from these people as we do, say, for example, ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. As a result, this has led to a lot of confusion. I don't know if confusion would be the right word, a lot of misinformation concerning these people. There's a lot of gaps that people like to fill in with some unseemly ideas in some cases or some unwarranted assumptions in other cases. But speaking of geography, let's jump into it to talk about the area that we're going to be focusing on here. If you're familiar with American geography, you can skip over this part. So Mississippian culture, Mississippian civilization gets its name first and foremost from that Mississippi River. The Mississippi River and the Mississippi River Basin is the largest river system in North America. As you can see from this map, it incorporates a huge portion of the United States, what is today the United States. And much like the Nile River in ancient Egypt, the Mississippi River would be the lifeblood of Mississippian civilization. Mississippian civilization will be an agricultural civilization, so regular access to water and to a river that didn't flood sporadically would be crucial to the development of these people and to the rise of very large cities in this area. The Mississippi River and all of its tributaries would also provide these people with an extensive and reliable trade network that would connect these people culturally. So we call it the Mississippian civilization, one, because of the geographical location, and two, because the people that are located on and around these rivers shared similar culture. The culture that we're talking about here is the culture that's left behind in the material artifacts, such as the pottery, the building techniques, the mound building especially, which we'll come back to in a second. There are similarities that we see. So the idea is that all of these people, although we're talking about a huge area that spanned over thousands of years, are loosely connected culturally speaking. Now, the extent to which they were directly influenced by each other, I don't want to overemphasize that because we simply don't know, but there is some influence in terms of those material techniques that I talked about. So I'd like to spend some time in this video focusing on some of the characteristic cultural traits of Mississippian culture. And again, just to remind you, I'm painting here in very broad strokes. As you'll notice from the map that I just showed you previously, we're talking about an extremely large geographical area, and we're also talking about a very long time period. So when I talk about Mississippian culture, I'm including lots of different distinctive ethnic, cultural, religious groups all into one just general lump category in order to talk about some of the general features that we see in this region. We're covering a time span that ranges all the way from 1700 BCE to roughly the 17th century CE. So again, we're talking about lots of different groups that came and went during that time period, but I'm lumping them all into one culture because of some of the common characteristics that they shared. Three major characteristics that I want to point out here. First is the construction of earthen mounds. There are several distinctive types of mounds that we have identified: conical, ridge, burial mounds. We'll get into a little bit of those details here in a second, but mound building is one of perhaps the hallmark identification of the culture, going all the way back to Poverty Point, which we'll discuss here, all the way into the 16th, 17th century. Now, there's a lot that we infer from these mounds, part of which is the religious, ceremonial, governmental structure that surrounded and supported the construction and use of these mounds. A lot of this is inference, but from the fact that these mounds exist, we have some sort of an indication about what the society, governmental structure, and all that was like. Furthermore, archaeological evidence from the surrounding areas of these mounds reveal that for the most part, they were surrounded by large cities, as we'll see here momentarily. We'll also speak a little bit about the governmental structure that maybe went into the construction of these. And third, there's kind of a shared economic and agricultural infrastructure centered around the production of crops, specifically maize or corn. all of which was required to support not just the massive infrastructures of the mounds themselves, but the large cities which surrounded these mounds. This is first and foremost an agricultural-based civilization, and a lot went into that in order to support the population sizes that we see in this area. As I said before, without a doubt, the most iconic feature of this culture are the mounds that they built and subsequently left behind for us to examine. I have a short quote here from the archaeologist Joe Sanders that I think will help us to understand some of the context and purpose of these mounds. Sanders says, mounds exhibit a variety of forms, but conical, dome, platform, and effigy mounds are the most common. Those are the different sorts of mounds. Some mounds were built in a single episode, that's at one time, while others had multiple stages of construction. We know that from some of these sites, as we'll see later with Poverty Point, that these mounds could have been built over several decades, maybe even hundreds of years, at least in terms of the maintenance to maintain the structure of the mounds. Okay, sorry. Conical mounds tend to be older than platform mounds, but structures were more common on platform mounds. Contrary to popular belief, not all mounds contain human burials, nor were they built as refuges. In fact, the first mound builders constructed their earthworks where flooding did not occur. There does not tend to be a singularity of purpose to mound building other than the act itself. Again, we don't always know why they built these mounds. What we do know, based on the wide variety of mounds, is that they probably served many different sorts of purposes. It is reasonable to conclude that building earthworks was a communal effort that involved planning, engineering, and organizing labor. So what this quote is pointing out is the variety of mounds, the variety of uses of these mounds, the fact that these mounds weren't always necessarily built at the same time, as we see with Poverty Point. They don't always necessarily involve cities or city building or governmental structures. The utility of the mounds themselves are about as varied as any form of artwork could be, that they were used for a wide variety of purposes, some of which are not super clear to us given the archaeological evidence. So as the quote mentions, there are different types of mounds. Now, conical mounds or burial mounds are some examples that we see at many of these sites. And as the name suggests, these were places in which people were buried. Oftentimes, when we are talking about burial mounds, much like with ancient Egypt, you're talking about the burial of very wealthy people. We know this from sites like Cahokia, in which we see who we believe to be a wealthy noble. We believe that he was a wealthy noble based on all the different sorts of artifacts and other people that were buried with him, that were buried in a ceremonial way with ceremonial objects and what seems like some sort of ritual that was performed around the burial itself. But not all of these mounds are burial sites. We also have ridgetop mounds, which we also see at Cahokia. These ridgetop mounds serve the purpose of supporting other structures such as houses, temples, and other communal spaces. So what would happen is that these mounds would be constructed with kind of a flat top, and a house would be placed, some sort of building would be placed on top of it. And what this diagram also shows is that we're also not just talking about giant clumps of dirt. I mean, if you go to these places themselves, these mounds look like hills. Now, of course, back then they probably looked much different because you're looking at, in some cases, centuries of water erosion as well as human damage through the use of plowing and use of these mounds for farming and agriculture by later non-native people. And so they don't have their original size and shape, but there's a lot of planning that went into this. And at some sites like Cahokia, what these mounds indicate could also be places of religious worship or ceremonial performances, such as Cahokia. We see large flat ridges that were built perhaps for the playing of a game that they call chunky or kunky. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. It's kind of like a stick and a ball game, similar to, I guess the closest modern comparison would be something like lacrosse. But we know some of these mounds were kind of built as platforms to house these ceremonies, and also included wooden circles made out of different stakes to signify certain astrological positions as well. As I mentioned before, there was a tremendous amount of labor that went into the construction of these mounds, which suggests to us that there was some sort of political system that lay behind the organization and compartmentalization of this labor, as is oftentimes the case. And one of the systems of political classification that you'll see thrown around, especially when dealing with ancient North American cultures, is this concept of the chiefdom. Now, although it has the name of chiefdom, this is logistically very similar to what you see in other places throughout the world when you're talking about forms of government such as a monarchy, although it might be slightly different. We have a good definition here by Robert Cornerio, who says that a chiefdom is an autonomous political unit comprising of a number of villages or communities under the permanent control of a paramount chief. I say that this is functioning logistically in the same way as a monarchy because, like a monarchy with the chiefdom, you're going to have a singular person or sometimes like a smaller or larger family, so similar to like an aristocracy, who are going to be making political decisions on behalf of the village. And oftentimes what we see in Northern American communities, what we think was operating here is that you would have a very large center city such as Cahokia, who had a bunch of different satellite communities surrounding it, kind of like suburbs to the larger city. And it's believed that these suburbs, in some way, shape, or form, were submissive or tributaries to that larger city. And the idea here is that you would have the chief or the prominent family who would rule over, so to speak, not just the main city, but also these satellite places as well. Now, this idea of chiefdom is also intimately linked with this idea of kinship, in which power is passed down from family member to family member. Again, very much in the same way as you see in other examples of monarchy, where the king has a son, the king transfers that power to the son. But as we know, it's not always that smooth of a transition, and oftentimes there's conflict involving who gets the power, when they get the power, and their claims to that power. And kinship in this case is typically an organizing principle loosely based on marriage, age, or sex, can affect one's social status in the kinship hierarchy. Again, we don't know too much about the details concerning the system of government that was in place at places like Cahokia or Aztalan, as we'll see, but we do know that some sort of political structure existed, and that this political structure undoubtedly involved a strong person or strong family, strong in the sense of their economic influence on the community, that was at the top making the political decisions. Now, in terms of the religious system that was in place at these sorts of sites, it's similar to the governmental system in that we know some general features that are commonly shared throughout all these different sites. There's some common imagery and symbols that are used. But as far as the details, we can only really speak about it in a vague sense. Archaeologists have come to term the religious tradition that took place in Mississippian culture as the southeastern ceremonial complex, and this refers to a system of symbols and imagery, including the mounds themselves, that are commonly found at all these different sorts of sites. Part of the major difficulty here is the fact that the Mississippian civilization and culture didn't leave behind a formal writing system or a collection of their myths, stories, or sacred text. So unlike other traditions, such as the major world religions of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, we don't have a collection of central stories that unite all of these people into one like coherent belief system. All that we have is the stuff that we left behind. So again, this would be like trying to piece together the puzzles of Christianity by walking into a church, but you don't actually have the written text of the Bible and trying to figure out what all the different symbols and structure of the church itself means. So when we talk about the religious tradition that was present, we can only speak in these really big general terms. One of the things that stands out with this religious tradition is it has a couple of different names. The Axis Mundi, it's the sort of cosmological system that we believed underline these different sites and ideas. So to be clear, we have imagery and symbolism which suggest that there were undoubtedly different gods and goddesses. Like most indigenous religions, you're undoubtedly talking about a culture in which oral tradition played a large part in the passing down and the telling and retelling of maybe certain central myths, origin stories, explanation of the peoples themselves, in which the gods and goddesses played a role in this. We don't have, unfortunately, specific names of these gods and goddesses. We can only glean this from the evidence that we do have. And one of the things that we see is sort of this division throughout most indigenous religions is there's this philosophical idea called animism. And animism is this concept, and let me back up a little bit. In a lot of religious traditions, we have this sometimes separation, sometimes it's not so clearly a separation between the physical on the one hand and the spiritual on the other, the gods and goddesses and heaven, and sometimes the underworld being the spiritual. And of course, we humans exist on the material physical plane. And in a lot of traditions, you have this idea of the soul, which is the spiritual component of the human being, or the animating principle of the human being. In animism, there isn't a clear distinction between the physical and the spiritual in the same way that you see it in religious traditions like, let's say, Christianity, in which you have the creator God who stands separate and distinct from its creation. Within a lot of indigenous or primal religions, the natural world will be endowed with spirit in the same way that human beings can be said to be endowed with spirit or soul. So a lot of times sacred spaces such as mountains, streams, and lakes will be said to have spirits, as well as animals and people having spirits. But there is this sort of cosmological hierarchy to the physical and the spiritual. We call this the three-layered cosmology, which we see especially prominent in North American civilizations. So you have the upper layer being the realm of the heavens, so to speak. I'm using that word heavens very loosely to refer to the spiritual, the place where the major gods and goddesses dwell. The heavens being the home of various thunder or light deities in Native American traditions, the sun god, the supreme creator. Then we have that middle layer. That middle layer is, of course, the axis on which human beings live and dwell. This is our physical world. And then below the physical world, you have the underworld, sometimes the afterlife. And if the heavens are kind of characterized by light, lightning, wind, storms, the underworld will kind of be characterized by deities that like live in caves or live in darkness or live in the water. And the idea here of the axis, there's an axis that connects all three of these realms. So the idea here is that there are certain sacred sites that serve as a connection to the upper axis, or subsequently a connection to the lower axis, and that spirits or the spiritual, the soul, can transgress or move through these different axes. Now, again, the detail here is very vague. Most of what we know about the oral traditions are the oral traditions of tribes and peoples that are still around today. But if we're talking about Mississippian culture specifically, we don't know the details of the myths or stories or sacred texts that they told each other, although there is some indication that the stories that we have today may be reflective of that. All right, so there are a couple of examples of Mississippian cultural sites that I wanted to focus on that will hopefully illuminate some of those cultural aspects that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. First and foremost, we have Poverty Point. Up until about the 50s or the 60s, it was believed that the Poverty Point site was the oldest example of mound building that we have in North America. That has recently changed. I believe that it was in the 80s that we discovered Watson Break, which dates to about 3500 BCE. If I'm not mistaken, double check me on that date. Poverty Point dates to 1700 BCE, and although it's not the oldest, it's certainly the largest. And one of the more mysterious Mississippian sites. And the reason for the mystery surrounding Poverty Point is it doesn't really fit in with the kind of mainstream narrative regarding sites of this magnitude that we have in the ancient world. What I mean by that is that Poverty Point is a massive example of mound building. I think it occupies about 35 acres total. It's a monumentous mound building project that was undertaken at this site. What's interesting about it, much like Göbekli Tepe in the Middle East, is that Poverty Point is that civilization proper wasn't responsible for Poverty Point. What I mean by that is Poverty Point lasted, the site was occupied for roughly 600 years, and the construction that started on the site was actually done by hunters and gatherers and not some established city. So we have this standard narrative that these major examples of archaeological feats, of architectural feats that we see in the ancient world, things like the pyramids of Giza, the aqueducts of Rome, the Temple of Zeus, and even what we see in Mesoamerica, such as Chichen Itza, that these massive architectural programs could only be built with a supporting city and labor force. However, sites like Poverty Point show that it's possible that some of these sites were built and maintained by hunters and gatherers. So at the beginning of early construction, 1700 BCE with Poverty Point, there isn't evidence of settlement in the sense that there's not evidence of a large city existing there. Now, there will be, we see over the course of its time that people had occupied that space, that they do start to build cities there, and there were houses that were constructed there. But when it first started, nowadays the consensus is that it was built by hunters and gatherers. Now, Poverty Point is the largest and most complex of the late archaic earthwork occupation and ceremonial sites. What this means, the late archaic period being in that 1700 to 1000 BCE range. It's the largest of those sites. Here we have a brief description by an archaeologist of the site and what's at the site. At the center of the site is a plaza that covers about 37 acres and is believed to be used for ceremonial rituals, dances, games, and other activities. On the western side of the plaza, archaeologists have discovered several deep holes arranged in inner circles of various sizes. They believe the holes have held long poles, possibly serving as calendar markers. Poverty Point is an example of a holy site. We believe it's a holy site, and we believe that it's mimicking some sort of what we would call sacred geometry, that the site was laid out in a particular fashion to reflect some of the spiritual beliefs of the peoples that built it. As you can see here from the diagram of the site, we have I'll move my photo here. We have an aerial photo that shows you the mounds as seen from the sky today, as well as a artistic reconstruction of the mounds, of the elevated mounds, as well as the main platform that sits at the center. Because of how the mounds are laid out, because of the semicircle formation, the fact that they're all sort of facing this platform, we call it sacred geometry because it's believed that the shape of this site had some sort of spiritual significance. Now, what that significance is almost impossible to say because, again, we don't have a written record explaining why they laid it out in the particular way that they did. And at the end of that quote that I just mentioned, it referenced in that central plaza some post holes that were found, which were most likely the site of these large wooden posts that had some sort of astrological significance. Now, again, what that astrological significance was, whether it was merely religious, whether it was some sort of calendar that marked the changing of the seasons or astrological events, it's hard to say, but the site seems to be designed for a particular purpose. That purpose most probably had some sort of religious significance with how it was laid out. So we have this semicircle formation with this very large platform in the middle based off the debris that we found around the area. We know that there were certain times of the year in which a lot of people gathered there, possibly to celebrate some sort of religious holiday or significant cultural event. The platform that's right on the river. There's also some pyramid structures, some large mounds found outside of the platform. But Poverty Point being one of the oldest and largest examples of mound building that we have in the Mississippian culture. Another site I want to mention is Aztalan. Aztalan is located in modern-day Wisconsin, about an hour outside of the city of Milwaukee. Aztalan is one of the larger cities of the Mississippian culture, developed slightly before the rise of Cahokia, which was the largest city that we know about. Aztalan is interesting for a few reasons, one of which, going back to the introduction of this video, there's this stereotype of Native Americans being nomadic or semi-nomadic, traveling around, very mobile, traveling around in housing structures such as teepees. In Aztalan, we have evidence, we have very good evidence of what the houses of Mississippian cultures look like. We have these dugout walled houses, the material of which was used was a combination of wood, plaster, straw, hay sort of material that was put together in these sorts of that would become like hardened brick. And this is a very large city. At its peak, we're looking at anywhere from 20 to 30,000 people, which doesn't sound like a whole lot based on our standards. But if you look back in the medieval period, in the time period in which this is built, 900 to 1300 CE, this would have been one of the larger cities in the world. Again, cities, just as an example for comparison, in the 18th century United States, I oftentimes get to teach about the American Civil War in the city I live in, Savannah, Georgia. By the time the Civil War breaks out in 1860, you're looking at a population of less than 50,000 people, so close to the numbers here. And that's in the 18th century. So a very large city, even by 17th, 18th century standards. The settlements that are found in Aztalan are characterized by the construction of earthenwork mounds. They're very large mounds found at the site. Stockades. There was a wall that was built around the city, and houses decorated with Mississippian cultural pottery and agricultural practice. Again, the main staple crop here seems to be maize. This is the largest mound at Aztalan. It's a really impressive, even though most of it was plowed over by farmers before it was made a historical site. They've recreated the palisade wall. This is a recreation, first and foremost. We have the trenches where the posts were laid. We don't know exactly what the wall looked like, but that we know that it surrounded the city and helped to protect the population. So the largest of the Mississippian cities, without a doubt, one of the largest cities in pre-Columbian North America, and for its time, probably one of the largest cities in the world, is Cahokia. Cahokia, located in near modern-day St. Louis, just across the river from it. Cahokia was a site that we saw settlement beginning roughly 1500 BCE. People were settling there. People had settled there for a really long time, but they were coming and going. We see an explosion in the population of Cahokia really starting around 1000 CE. And the explosion is so massive that within a few decades, the city goes from a few thousand people to close to 40,000 people, it's estimated. Archaeologists call this the Big Bang of Cahokia because the population increased so quickly and so large. The population of Cahokia is up for discussion. Now, there's this main sort of downtown area that we have, and it's estimated that within that main downtown area, you're looking at anywhere from 6,000 to 15,000 people, perhaps. And then, like I was talking about when I was talking about the chieftain, you have various satellite communities associated with that main community. And the estimates here push up into, if all of that's taken together, push up into the 30,000, 40,000 people range. And if we're talking about 30,000, 40,000 people for 1300 CE, we're talking about one of the top 5 largest cities in the world. So very impressive. At Cahokia, we have 120 earthen mounds over an area of approximately 6 square miles. Again, that 6 square miles is that downtown area. The largest of the mounds is called Monk's Mound, and Monk's Mound, it was believed to be the largest man-made structure in North America up until like the first skyscrapers were built in places like New York City. It's pretty crazy. We have a tremendous amount of archaeological evidence that's been left over at Cahokia. One of the principal examples that we have of ridgetop mounds appears at Cahokia, how the city was laid out. And this is where we get some of a sense of the economic structure of some of these places. So again, you're talking anywhere from, on the conservative end, 10 to 40, to on the liberal end, 40,000 people that are inhabiting this place. And they had these ridge-top mounds, which were these flat surfaced at the top that they constructed houses on. And with Cahokia specifically, it was believed that on the larger of the ridge-top mounds is where you had the kind of the wealthier people would build their houses. So you have a visual representation of this class stratification that's taken place, with the wealthiest people living higher up and the poorer people living towards the bottom. And as I said before, when I was talking about these mounds are intentionally constructed with a combination of dirt, clay, and other materials. Also at Cahokia, we have large plazas. In these plazas, it was believed to be the location for different sorts of religious ceremonies, as well as games and festivals. And we also have some burial mounds at Cahokia, including the famous Birdman burial, the hawk burial, the wealthier person that was buried with a collection of seashells that were arranged to look like a falcon or a bird, one of the most extravagant burials that we found in North America. So all in all, what's important about these sites is they highlight those three key features that I mentioned earlier. What's distinctive is, of course, the mounds that they all built. These mounds are indicative of largest religious, governmental, and economic and agricultural institutions and structures, and everything else that comes along with it. Shows us that Native American civilization prior to the arrival of Europeans looked a lot like civilizations elsewhere in terms of large cities supported by massive agricultural infrastructure, and who built some absolutely astonishing architectural feats. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something, found something interesting. Please feel free to leave comments in the section below. And until next time, I'll see you all later.